Good afternoon, and welcome to this Hudson Institute panel on the Venezuela election agreement that lays the framework for presidential elections in 2024. My name is Dan Batlle, and I'm an adjunct fellow at Hudson Institute. The agreement signed by the Maduro regime and the opposition unitary platform provided some of the measures that the opposition sought for the 2024 elections, but it did not make any guarantees regarding the eligibility of candidates who have been disqualified by the regime, including the leading opposition candidate, María Corina Machado. After the agreement was signed, the Biden administration partially lifted sanctions on the Maduro regime, stating that sanctions relief would be reversed if the regime did not take certain steps by the end of November. This included reinstating all candidates who had been disqualified. Over the weekend, Venezuelans turned out in large numbers, about 2.4 million, to vote in primaries organized by the opposition. The leading candidate, María Corina Machado, won by a large margin, and the results suggested the possibility of a unified opposition going into the 2024 elections. To help us make sense of all this, we are very fortunate to have two distinguished guests today who have been deeply involved in Venezuela policy. We have Mark Feierstein, senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Albright Stonebridge Group. And we have José Cárdenas, a principal at the Cormick Group. I'd like to start by having our speakers provide a high-level look at the agreement and give us the main takeaways on the agreement. Jose, could you start?
Sure, Dan, and thank you. Thanks to you. Thanks to the Hudson Institute. It's a sincere pleasure to be here with my friend Mark Feierstein as well to talk about obviously something that those of us who have been devoting a lot of time and attention to a crisis that has been unfolding over, gosh, it must be 2 decades now. We are finally seeing some movement, some tectonic shifts. Where it will all go, of course, is something we'll talk about. Where it might go, where it might not go. But I think that in terms of the agreement that was signed in Barbados, I think that we have to be clear, this is something that the Biden administration has been working on for many, many months now. I think that they were almost emphasizing that this was a deal between the regime and the opposition. Let's make no mistake about it. This is something that was crafted largely by the Biden administration in direct talks with the Maduro regime. To me, the agreement in Barbados signaled too much of a sign of desperation on the Biden administration's part. And I think that, as I said, this has been something they've been trying to achieve for months, and the Maduro regime was simply not responding. It wasn't offering really making any effort to meet the Biden administration halfway. So it appears as if the Biden administration had to up the ante to get around the regime's recalcitrance. And when you signal to your adversary that you're more interested in a deal than they are, I think it has negative repercussions for what you come away with. And so I think that when we talk about a desperation on the part of the Biden administration is that they're driven by two particularly intractable issues that are complicating the White House's strategy for 2024. The first is migration, and the second is energy situation, the price of gas at the pump. And I think that those were motivators also to get this deal done. Migration, that they believe that if you can provide some sanctions relief, Venezuelans will stop coming. Right now, we know for a fact Venezuelans are the #1 ethnic group, nationality showing up at the southern border right now. That's a big problem for the White House. The second, of course, is the war in Ukraine, the instability in the Middle East, all wreaking havoc on international oil markets. I think that the administration was desperate to send a signal to speculators that more oil was in the pipeline, no pun intended, to calm markets. So I think that, and then we'll talk about Venezuelan democracy. But first of all, that is my take on what happened in Barbados.
Mark, over to you.
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. Appreciate the bipartisan nature of this discussion. You know, Jose's a Nationals fan. I'm a Mets fan. We don't always find common ground when it comes to baseball, but perhaps we can find some common ground on Venezuela, notwithstanding his opening comments. But no, in terms of the agreement, I think that there were important things there for all sides. I mean, the opposition got a lot. The primary was preserved. And let's keep in mind that just a month ago or a couple weeks ago, there was real concern the primary would not take place. And it took place and was very successful, as Jose noted, because of the negotiation process. Political prisoners are starting to be released, and we can anticipate that more will be released. And again, that was a product of the negotiations. International observers are about to be, for the 2024 electoral process, are getting their visas. They're about to be heading toward to Venezuela, and again, that was thanks to the negotiations. And the voter registry, another important thing. Updating the voter registry, another important matter for the opposition. That's going to happen as well. Again, those all thanks to the negotiations, and those were things the opposition wanted and things the United States wanted. Obviously, the regime got sanctions relief that they very much want and need in advance of the 2024 election. They're hoping for an economic recovery that would boost them politically. I think investors certainly got something out of this in terms of the ability now to engage, in bond trading and also engage in the gold sector, and of course, international companies, multinational companies can engage now more in the petroleum and the oil and gas sector as well. I think that's potentially a positive for U.S. consumers if in fact there is more oil on the market, and that can reduce gasoline prices. But I think most important, the agreement that was signed in Barbados is a victory for the Venezuelan people. The Venezuelans are committed to the electoral process. We saw that on Sunday, how enthusiastic they are to come out and vote. They believe that the elections provide the best route to resolve the crisis there. So to the extent that this agreement allows for improved electoral conditions, that's a real plus. But we also know that the Venezuelan people want the sanctions lifted, and they want the lifting to be conditioned. And again, that's what happened in this agreement as well. So I think all parties got something out of this, but I think most important, it was a victory for the Venezuelan people.
Following up on that, Mark, for many months it seemed that there was no progress on the talks. It seemed that the Maduro regime had no incentive to negotiate. What led to them finally agreeing to sit down, and why now?
So I think there were incentives for all the parties, or the three parties, the opposition, the government, and the United States. In the case of the regime, they've long wanted lifting of sanctions. I think there was a recognition that they were potentially in trouble for 2024. They've seen how the opposition has come together and unified, and they're getting nervous about their ability to win a minimally credible election. So they're hoping that this sanctions will provide them with resources and provides for some sort of economic recovery in the coming months and over the next year. I think on the part of the United States, there was always an intention to use the leverage of sanctions to provide for improved electoral conditions. But in addition, as Jose noted, there was concern about migration, and there's concern about energy prices. So again, to the extent that the agreement would potentially reduce the likelihood that Venezuelans would feel a need to make a dangerous trek to the United States, I think that obviously is a goal as well. And again, as I noted, to the extent that there's additional production in the coming months that might reduce gasoline prices, that is obviously a plus for the United States. And then in terms of the opposition, I think is now committed to the electoral process in a way they have not been in recent years. There have been real divisions about the value of elections. The opposition is all in now. I think that helped contribute as well to the possibility for an agreement.
Jose, many are skeptical about this agreement, and you point out two of the possible drivers for Biden administration facilitating this agreement. However, the enthusiasm that we saw in Venezuela over the weekend suggests that Venezuelans were not deterred or not discouraged by what happened in Barbados. How do you think about that, and how do you think about the effect of the agreement on Venezuelans and their commitment to vote and to participate in the democratic process?
Yeah, Dan, I see that. I see really not much of a connection between what happened in Barbados and what happened on Sunday. I think that the opposition was able, and especially María Corina Machado, was able to create a momentum on the ground by her campaigning. The social media posts that you saw from her rallies were just extraordinary. And she created, almost by herself, and her presence, a momentum regardless of what happened or didn't happen in Barbados. I think that I agree with Mark, the regime was looking for tangible, why after so many months did they finally show up and sign a deal? I think that they were most definitely after tangible benefits such as hard currency for the upcoming election next year. And they have stolen so much from the patrimony of the Venezuelan people that they looked around, and this last report that came out that they're missing $20 billion in oil sales. Well, I assume they looked around and figured out the coffers were bare. They're not going to pull their own money that they stole out of Switzerland and other bank accounts, but they got to find some money quick, and they want other people to pay for it because they're not going to use their own stolen money for an election. But Chavismo will, and I guess you have to admit, this is not just Chavismo, but come election time, a government is going to want to spend a lot of money to get people out and vote for them. So that was part of it. And I also think that there was an effort by the regime, by coming to Barbados, to undercut María Corina Machado by giving a new boost to the unitary platform negotiating team. We have to remember that Machado is not part of the unitary platform. She has not been part of the negotiations. She has always been apart from the traditional opposition leadership in Venezuela. And so the regime is more comfortable with the people they know in the opposition platform, coalition. So this was an attempt to marginalize and boost it failed spectacularly because María Corina Machado won 95% of the vote. So that's part of what I see as behind the initiative of the regime for even coming to Barbados. And you asked, what was the other question you had to?
Oh, well, just you had referred to two considerations driving the administration.
Yeah.
Migration and oil.
So that's how I see the motivations of the Maduro regime.
Mark, one of the concerns about the agreement is obviously it does not speak to eligibility of candidates. There is some concern about how far the Biden administration will be willing to push to ensure their reinstatement. It is, once there is sanctions relief, it can be difficult to reinstate sanctions. How do you respond to those concerns?
So, look, I think anyone outside Venezuela especially needs to approach this issue with a dose of humility, and that's certainly true of former policymakers, because we've all failed in different ways. I think certainly the Bush administration, did not achieve what they wanted. with regard to Venezuela. I think Jose served in the Bush administration. I served in the Obama administration. I think we certainly fell short. The Trump approach was a disaster and a clear failure, as Trump administration officials would acknowledge. And I think the Biden administration has an opportunity to succeed where their predecessors did not. And I think they already, in some ways, are succeeding. They reached a deportation agreement. We talked about the primary, which took place. We talked about political prisoners being released. So there's a whole series of things that are happening already. So this is not some sort of, the United States is not taking steps in anticipation of steps that the regime might take. They're taking steps in response to things that the regime has already done. So number one. Second, I would say that it's important to keep in mind the genesis of these sanctions. They were imposed largely during the Trump administration, I guess in 2018, 2019. And there was a debate within the administration, as I understand from people who served at the time, about the extent of the sanctions, particularly on the oil sector. And they called it the nuclear option, because there was concern that they would do great damage to the Venezuelan economy, that it would crater the economy even more so than it had already been suffering, and that it would not necessarily produce regime change. Well, that's exactly what happened. I don't think that there was an intention at the time to leave sanctions in for 5 years. There was this idea, administration officials said at the time, it'll be a matter of days, a matter of weeks, months, and Maduro will be gone. Well, here he is 5 years later. Now that said, there may have been a certain logic to the sanctions at that time in 2018, and 2019, and there was a gambit around the support for Guaido and his interim presidency. But just because it made sense, 4 or 5 years ago, doesn't mean that it makes sense now at a very different moment in the world, very, very different moment within Venezuela. So I think, if the Biden administration were starting from scratch, they wouldn't have necessarily impose those sanctions. But I think they have used them smartly as leverage to achieve a number of gains with regard to electoral conditions. Now, in terms of there's obviously one big outstanding issue, which is the right of Machado to run. But it is, laid out in the agreement, and the State Department does speak to it, and they've been very clear that if there is not a process in place and a calendar in place by the end of November, then that some of these sanctions would be reinstated.
If I could add to that, I think that, Mark laid out earlier some of the provisions that were achieved in Barbados. I would concede that they do sort of establish a toehold, but it all depends on the follow-up, and there's got to be an absolute 100% whole of government effort to ensure not only that what was agreed to in Barbados is implemented, but where do we go from there? And I think that some of the red lines that absolutely have to be established before we can even get to a debate on what the election's going to look like is the eligibility has to be restored to María Corina Machado. I think that the disposition of the diaspora vote has to be decided. Mark mentioned, okay, we're going to start going through the electoral registry, which is thought to have a lot of deceased people. Chavismo can't organize anything. So the registry is outdated, but left out of Barbados is what about the diaspora vote? And then the third red line, just off the top of my head, is that Mark mentioned also the International Observation Team. That has to be, we have to follow the standard. And as you know, Dan, from your time at AID, that those international observation missions have to be in place in country 6 months prior to the vote. Okay, this is not a bunch of VIPs showing up to wander around voting booths on election day. No, you have professionals, electoral monitors, starting 6 months out to absolutely monitor every conceivable aspect of the election, because nobody trusts Maduro to have a free and fair any semblance of a free and fair election. So we have to build in now as many safeguards as possible. Even in the end, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I remain skeptical that even if all of that is achieved, that we still can get to that place of some semblance of a competitive election. But I agree with Mark is that, look, this is really the last best chance to get it done.
Yeah, on the election observation, seems like a good starting point would be implementation of some of the recommendations from the EU's last observation mission from the last elections. But I take your point there, Mark. On the question of the diaspora, this is an important issue, but it's also a complex issue because there's issues of trust for Venezuelans who are abroad, trust with the regime, but also trust when in some cases they don't have, they're not documented in the countries where they're residing. So how do you think about that? And did the agreement do enough on that issue?
Well, we saw a strong turnout from the diaspora on Sunday. I think the figures, I forget, 100,000 more from around the world. That's obviously encouraging. There is not yet a commitment that Venezuelans in exile will have a right to vote in 2024. That's among the things I think that the opposition should be fighting for and the international community should push for as well. But I think I think in terms of the conditions, and as you said, the EU laid out some 21 recommendations. And they're all important, and we should try to get all of them done. But the reality is there will not be a free and fair election in Venezuela. That's not the objective here. And the question is, will the election be minimally credible? And for that to happen, I think you need a few basic things, and I would focus on three. Number one is updating the voter registry. Number two would be ensuring that people can come out and vote on election day. And then number three would be guaranteeing that the opposition has a right to choose the candidate that it wants. With those three conditions, if you meet those three conditions, the opposition would be in a position to be quite competitive. And I've observed plenty of elections in authoritarian settings, and the playing field does not have to be level for democratic forces to emerge victorious. I was in Chile in 1988. I was in Nicaragua in 1990. Obviously, there are plenty of differences between Venezuela today and those settings. But I think talk about free and fair elections is a high and unreasonable bar, and not necessarily something that we need to achieve for the election to meet some credible standard.
Yeah, even accepting that the elections will be something short of free and fair, I think there's a concern that that the Maduro regime possibly tries to meet the end of November deadline to do certain things, but then sort of stalls for time and in between then and the elections. How do you see the administration and others keeping pressure on the regime on these issues?
Well, is it me for?
Yeah, for you.
So first, I think we tend to focus on Washington and the international community, but I think the most important actors are in Venezuela. And like María Corina comes out of Sunday in a very strong position, winning 93% of the vote, with a turnout as high as she did. She is clearly the leader of the opposition. And it's going to be important for her to maintain unity within the opposition. And we already saw before the primary chatter about selecting another candidate or some sort of plan B because she doesn't have the right to run. And we've heard some of that, we heard a little bit of that after the election as well. But her intention is to use this victory to mobilize the Venezuelan people, to mobilize the international community to ensure that she has the right to run. And I think for that to occur, first and foremost, the opposition has to stay united. But I think that the signals from the international community have to be very clear as well. And it can't just come from the United States. It needs to come from Brazil, from Colombia, from the EU, and others. And in terms of the pressure, look, I think there are a couple deadlines in the State Department statement. First is the end of November, and then there's the 6-month license. And I think that, investors are going to be hesitant to jump right in because there is a level of uncertainty. They don't know what's going to happen on December 1st. They don't know what's going to happen 6 months from now. So I think that's, not only do you have the explicit deadlines there, but you have sort of an implicit uncertainty that's built in. And I think if the regime really wants investment to pour in and resources, they're going to need to take steps, not only to assure the United States, but also to ensure investors that this is a bet that makes sense, and that makes sense to jump in at this point before any election in 2024.
Yeah, I would add that I do believe that the foreign influence is going to be extremely important. And Mark is right. The locus of this activity will always be on the ground in Venezuela, but I think the Europeans can play an important role, and that's going to require the Biden administration to engage with the EU constantly to keep them from straying, frankly. Because if you leave it up to them, we'll wind up with some Spanish originated solution that will mess everything up. So engaging with the EU, and look, I mean, we have to also go, and there has to be pressure put on Petro and Lula, because they have been extremely solicitous of Maduro over the past year, and I think that both of them, whatever we think of them, they were both democratically elected, and for them to make excuses or allow for something less than a democratic process from going in Venezuela, I mean, that exposes them. And I would point out this too, is that I've been watching social media, obviously, and a lot of people have pointed out that, hey, remember, Petro was disqualified too one time from running for office, and of course he threw a fit. President Petro, where are you now? On the case of María Corina Machado. So if they want to be accepted into the polite company of small d democratic community, I think that the Biden administration needs to start making it more clear to them that this buddy show with Maduro is hurting democracy now that this process has begun with Sunday. And now that everyone's expecting a presidential election in whatever form by October of next year. So that's going to give everybody sort of a concentration point. And I think that there's some there's some diplomatic heavy lifting that the Biden administration can do, but they need to herd these cats into a very specific agenda to promote the democratic process in Venezuela.
Yeah, one of the virtues, I think, of the Trump strategy at the outset was that the administration built a strong coalition of allies to support the process. But the sort of the makeup of the leadership in the region today is much different, and as you've alluded to, the Europeans have a very different approach. So where do you go for other partners to help support this process? Either of you. Sure.
Yeah, so I think there's a difference between virtuousness and effectiveness, because we tend to evaluate countries based on how hard they are rhetorically on the Maduro regime. And obviously, it's important to have someone like Boric be very clear-eyed and state, in very clear terms, what's going on in Venezuela and speak to the nature of the regime. But I think it's also important, as Jose noted, to have people like Petro and people like Lula who can communicate and engage with Maduro in a way that the United States can't, the Norwegians can't. I think Petro, if I'm not mistaken, has already said publicly that Machado should have the right to run, and he's pointed to his own case. So I'm hopeful in the coming months that the Colombians and Brazilians will play a productive role. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we don't necessarily want every country to be doing the same thing. There are different roles for different countries, and they can all be complementary. And the United States obviously has an important role in terms of using the leverage of sanctions. I think the Norwegians obviously have an important role as facilitators and mediators. You've got Boric and others who will be very clear-eyed publicly about the nature of the regime. And then you have countries like Brazil and Colombia who can engage in a different way, in a way that we obviously cannot. But I think, collectively, I think there's a real opportunity for the international community to try to produce a more positive outcome here.
Yeah, Dan, I would say that, there's an opportunity here, I think, because, the pendulum just may be swinging, back to, the moderate right. Obviously, Noboa was elected in Ecuador. That could have been a disastrous situation for Venezuela if it had gone to a return to Correísmo. President Santiago Peña from Paraguay is in town today. I saw him this morning at the Heritage Foundation. He had some I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to mention competitors, but no, in all seriousness, he had some very strong words about being a voice for democracy in the region. We're going to see what happens in Argentina. There could be a huge swing there. And so, the balance is going to hold. I think there are voices, Boric in Chile. So I think that that we can hold the region. There are going to, and of course, Lacalle in Uruguay has been outspoken as well. Small country, but very, very virtuous. No, but in all seriousness, people look at Uruguay, democratic credentials, non-parallel. So, I think there are partners that we can, and again, it builds sort of a, you want to build a cordon around the Petros, the AMLOs. AMLO is off on his own, but I think that you can build a cordon around Petro and Lula to demonstrate that they can either be with Maduro or the small d Democrats. And, it was fun in games while there wasn't anything at stake in Venezuela for the past couple of years, but it just got real on Sunday. And now it's the time for people like Petro and Lula. Fun and games are over with Maduro. It's time to get serious about democracy. The Biden administration can go to them and say, look, you've been caterwauling about sanctions for 2 years now. We are preparing to lift them, but you gotta help. None of this, abrazoing around with Maduro anymore. And when the United States government wants to get its point across, it can. And so I think it's on the Biden administration to let them know the fun and games are over.
Mark, I want to go to talk about the primaries for a minute. You've done polling in Venezuela before. You're very familiar with the landscape there. Some were concerned that with the consolidation of support behind Machado leading up to the primary, that there might be less enthusiasm, but the reverse happened. There was great enthusiasm. Are we seeing something new and different in Venezuela and in the Venezuelan electorate?
So yes and no. Well, first, the Sunday was extraordinary. To get 2.5 million people out, for a primary that they had to organize by themselves, set up all sorts of new voting centers, with all sorts of obstacles that the regime put in place, blocking the website and making it more difficult for people to find out where they're supposed to vote, efforts at intimidation, obviously restrictions on the media. The weather that day didn't necessarily cooperate in all parts of the country, so it was pretty impressive turnout. And I think the regime is rattled, and that explains why they've been reacting the way they have the last couple days. But I think it's also a reflection of, as I noted before, the commitment that the Venezuelan people have to the electoral process and overcoming whatever obstacles are put in their place. But that's been true for some time. I think we tend to forget that there have been plenty of elections, even during the Chavez Maduro period. The opposition has often done well. In 2007, under Chavez, the opposition defeated a constitutional reform effort. In 2015, the opposition won a supermajority in the National Assembly. In 2021, the opposition got more votes than the ruling party did in the local elections, and they would have won, more governor's races and more mayor's races had they put forward common slates of candidates. So, when the opposition has taken advantage of elections and competed, they've actually done fairly well, and I think it's a reflection of the continued democratic spirit in that country that is alive and well. And to the extent that there was fear, I think that fear has been dissipated. But I think it's really the opposition in some ways that's catching up to the desires of the Venezuelan people. For a long time, the opposition was looking at other solutions, maximum pressure, all options on the table, all sort of that nonsense. But now they're going back to their roots and working with and mobilizing the Venezuelan people who are eager to be mobilized.
This question is for both of you. I want to ask where you see Venezuela 1 year from now, starting with you, Jose.
I tend to be, in watching the birth and the development of Chavismo since the late 1990s, very difficult. I have learned a lot about not getting out too far in front of yourself in predicting which way things are going to go. I don't think Chavismo has any intention of ceding power, whether peacefully or any other way. But I think that enough of a movement can be generated to challenge seriously the regime and demonstrate to the world that the Maduro regime is illegitimate. Now, what does that get you? $5 and a cup of coffee at Starbucks. But I do believe it's important that nobody becomes comfortable, that small d Democrats around the world, democratic countries, becomes comfortable with Maduro as a permanent part of the political landscape in Venezuela. Some time ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, I remember reading it. There was an editorial in the Washington Post that said it was around one time, one crisis or another, and said that look, if this continues the way it is, that everybody has to get comfortable with the fact there's going to be another Cuba in the Western Hemisphere. Well, that may be, but we got to do everything. Obviously the 82nd Airborne is not going to land in Venezuela. There's going to be no military solution to this. So what do good people have? All we have is our moral outrage, and we can't let up. I think that every effort over the next 6-8 months until October has to be about promoting the legitimacy of the opposition and their cause, and let the regime expose itself, as if we needed more evidence, but to expose itself for the illegitimate dictatorship that it is. And the United States will have to abide by the fact that, there will be I think there will always be a political movement here in this country, not to rescue the regime by letting oil companies back in en masse. There will always be a political opposition to recognizing, having normal relations with Venezuela while Maduro is in power. So in these very dreadful circumstances, that's kind of what we have no choice but to continue to push the opposition's cause. And I shouldn't even say the opposition, I said Venezuelan people's cause for restoration of some sort of constitutional rule. I don't think that as Mark was saying earlier, I agree. I don't see this crowd of, this is less a government than it is a mafia. And they've done untold damage, not only to the Venezuelan people, but to their neighbors as well. With the instability generated by the migration crisis, the transnational organized crime that has set up shop there, we're going to have a real problem, long-term problem on our hands. I mean, it's been 20 years already. But if Maduro escapes this last round in October of next year, then we just got to figure out, okay, how do we go back to a sanctions regime that we make the statement as a country that we're not going to engage and subsidize the repression in Venezuela.
Okay. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. I mean, first, if I can speak a bit more to the polling. So I've been polling in Venezuela off and on for 20 years now. And so I think it's helpful to look at sort of the history of public opinion there and over this period. It helps us understand where we are now, where things may be going. Hugo Chavez was quite popular. I mean, at his height, he had 60% approval, and he won elections legitimately. When Maduro took office, he was at some 50%. Over time, it's declined. And now he's, 20%? And he has been there for years. And I think he's sort of at his floor and his ceiling. I don't see him moving up much, but amazingly, I don't see him going down very much either. What's fascinating, and we talked earlier about Machado, is how her image has changed. She's, for a long time, was quite unpopular. She was among the most unpopular opposition leaders in the country. And that started to change a couple of years ago, and polling a year ago, showed her starting to rise, and then by this spring, she had a commanding lead in the polls. And when I started telling people that she's going to win the primary, she's going to win it easily, back in May, people were surprised. Of course, over time, every poll showed that, and it became very clear that wasn't going to be the case. But now she's quite popular, and she's not just popular with the opposition; she's popular overall. And I think that explains why the regime is so nervous, because she would trounce Maduro today in an election. It would not be close. And we can talk about electoral conditions, but it wouldn't matter very much. You would need an extraordinary level of fraud to change the result. So in terms of where we're going over the next year, to quote a former boss, former Secretary of State Albright, I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And look, I'm hopeful that there will be a minimally credible election, that there'll be a democratic transition, and that we'll be able to lift all sanctions, and that Venezuela will be prosperous again, and then people will not have to flee and make this very dangerous trek to the United States and other countries. But I think for that to happen, there's an important piece I think we didn't talk about today, which is what sort of negotiations and offers need to be made to the regime to give them incentive to give up power. Because lifting of sanctions obviously is not enough. That's just designed, from their perspective, to improve their electoral prospects. But what happens if they lose an election? What sort of assurances do they need? Because Maduro and others are afraid of going to jail, frankly, either in Venezuela, the United States, or somewhere else. And they face a lot of threats. They've got a bounty. There's a bounty on Maduro's head from the State Department. There are indictments from the Department of Justice. You've got the International Criminal Court is on them. You've got European Union cases. You've got potential prosecutions in Venezuela. But the opposition is prepared to negotiate, based on some form of transitional justice. We've seen plenty of examples, in Latin America and elsewhere. So I think that's the next phase. And arguably, there's a next phase of negotiations which involves the opposition trying to achieve the right of Machado to run in exchange for some sort of assurances for the regime. What happens if they were to lose an election? What rights would the PSUV have? What sort of co-governance might there be? Whatever arrangement might be made, I think there is an openness, at least on the part of the opposition, to make some offers. I don't think it's happened formally yet. I'm not even sure if it's happened informally, but at some point soon that needs to happen.
If I could flag one thing that sort of follows on something Mark was saying about, and it's getting back to María Corina Machado, and is one thing we have to watch very carefully, and this is, the whole idea of her eligibility. And this is something Mark talked about in his article in America's Quarterly. I encourage everyone to read it. Is that the way the regime is looking at this is they think that they could use, I'm projecting, they think that they can use her question of eligibility to divide the opposition. And you'll see references to a plan B, and it's already started. And this causes me a great deal of concern because I think this is the regime's strategy going forward. They want to divide the opposition on the question of her eligibility, because there are people who will be out there ready to say that, well, look what happened in Cárdenas last time around. The regime retroactively disqualified the winner of that governorship, and they put another person up there. And so you'll start, the talk is beginning that if the regime holds its ground on María Corina Machado's eligibility, well, the opposition will have to just come up with another candidate. I think that would be disastrous. I think it would be exactly what the regime wants and what they're trying to get. So we got to be very, I'm glad that the Biden administration jammed them on that. I mean, I wish we had gotten more guarantees at the table, but the administration has been pretty clear that I don't know if they've actually used the word red line on Machado, but it seems very close to one. It's either she's eligible or there's no recognition from Washington that this is a legitimate election. And of course, then everything flows from there. So watch closely what happens. I think that the regime is trying to figure out how do we both comply with some sort of deliverable by the end of November, and at the same time keep up this operation to split the opposition on her candidacy.
I would just add briefly. So I think there are 4 potential electoral scenarios. One is Machado has the right to run and wins. Second, she doesn't get the right to run, but she endorses another candidate, but in a solution, and that person wins, because I think almost anyone endorsed by the opposition would defeat Maduro now. Third would be some sort of a Nicaragua style, just total crackdown, no real election, or some effort, some Guatemala style thing where after the election they try to prevent the winner from taking office. And then fourth, what I think the regime is trying to achieve is by not lifting the ban on María Corina, sort of forcing her out of the process, encourage her voters to abstain. The rest of the opposition, or parts of the opposition, meanwhile, do put forward a candidate. And then, with a fractured opposition, some people staying home, Maduro potentially wins a plurality. I think that's the best case for the regime, and I think that's what they're angling for.
Okay, thank you. Jose, I want to pick up on something that you alluded to. You mentioned the role that Spain has played in Venezuela, and one of the models that Spain likes to talk about is the pacted transition and the idea of negotiations between elements within the regime and the opposition, similar to what happened in Spain at the end of the Franco years. Mm-hmm. Given that Venezuela has seen periodic elections through the years and they have not served to advance democracy, why not think about this type of approach?
Well, I think that part of the verdict on Sunday was that the Venezuelan people were also making a very clear statement that they're done with negotiated solutions. And by vesting everything in María Corina Machado, because she's been critical in the past of negotiations with the regime. It's been an almost I'm not going to criticize the opposition negotiators. I mean, they're going to a knife fight with a pea shooter, and so, but she has been critical, and so I think that I read into her victory a loss of confidence in traditional political parties and traditional people that would be involved. I think that if María Corina was the leader and she proposes going into a negotiation with the regime, then I think that's a different story, because I think she has legitimacy now, and she has vested in her all these pent-up aspirations and frustrations of the Venezuelan people. So the usual suspects, no. But if it all depends on her and what she wants to do with this mandate. She's been pretty clear that she's going all the way to the end in terms of the election. But following that, who knows? Who knows what she is ultimately going to decide to do with the power she has now? But it has to be absolutely. If there's going to be any consideration of those options, it has to be somebody who's just got 100% trust of the Venezuelan people. I think they have been disappointed too many times in the past by efforts to do this electorally, coming out in the streets, putting their lives at risk, so much so that now 7 million Venezuelans have left the country. They've basically given up on trying to change it from within. But that's how I would see it. My concern is you're taking it away from the voice of the people and putting it into people who really haven't closed the deal in the past. And so if she says it, and if she does it, maybe that's a different consideration. But any other actors don't see it.
So I think this is a really important point, I think, and there's sort of a Nixon to China element, what you're suggesting, which is I think that Machado has the opportunity to go to the regime and convey to the regime, look, if you make a deal with me, I can sell it to the Venezuelan people. I can sell it to skeptics in Washington, like Jose Cárdenas and his allies. Rosales can't do that. Capriles can't do that. Other people can't do that, but she can. And they can be assured that if she makes a deal, it's going to hold. That would be less true, I think, if she were to make a deal with other actors that they would rather deal with.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two questions from the audience. And we might have a mic somewhere.
Not him. Not him.
Thank you very much. Excellent conversation about the deal and what's next. One observation about the electoral agreement signed in Barbados. In point 2, there is mention of the question of registering voters abroad in Venezuela. It doesn't talk about the diaspora per se, but there is language about the question of special registration processes, and that includes people abroad. Obviously, that would require a lot of work in terms of diplomatic representation, and that's a whole another issue that would probably have to be addressed in the context of those negotiations about those processes. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. And then my question for the panelists is, we've seen a number of really important initiatives from the Hill about, in a bipartisan voice, about what has been essential in terms of U.S. policy toward Venezuela. We had the important letter about the primaries. What else besides supporting the opposition and its legitimacy, which I think is a great idea, what else can we get in a bipartisan fashion. Is there the chance for there to be equally strong voice about a Machado-led negotiation, as Jose mentioned? In other words, what else besides full support for the opposition can we ask for from the Hill in terms of a bipartisan approach? Thank you.
It's a great question, Michael. We haven't talked about Capitol Hill. I guess I referenced it earlier when I was talking about an opposition in the United States to a normalization and things like that. And what I was thinking in my head, of course, was mostly bipartisan coalition on Capitol Hill. I think that it's greatly unfortunate what happened to Senator Menendez, because he probably more than anyone was the gatekeeper on keeping everybody honest on Venezuela. And but I think that there are others ready to stand up on the Democratic side. Of course, we know that Senator Durbin has been very, very active on Venezuela. I think Senator Kaine wants to actually had a conversation with the senator about this, and he's very much wants to get more engaged on Venezuela in the coming months. Now, where can that go? I think that I think it has to be a delicate combination, and nothing in Capitol Hill is delicate anymore, of sticks and carrots. I think that it's just going to be a tripartite, three-dimensional chess between the Hill, the administration, and Caracas and the opposition. This matrix is going to be very, very delicate, I think, because you don't. For my Republican friends, I think that we need to channel. They need to channel their energies into. To be blunt, to keep the administration honest on Venezuela. I don't think that our Democratic friends that pro-democracy in Venezuela, Democratic members of Congress like Debbie Wasserman Schultz and as the aforementioned senators, they're not going to want to actually. They're going to want to exercise a lot of quiet communication with the Biden administration on concerns and leakage. In other words, softening without appropriate concessions. So I think it's going to be this sort of very unruly mix of sticks and carrots, and trying to shape an effort that still holds the regime to account. And I think that you probably will see, again, the Democrats are going to be obviously reticent about publicly. I mean, Menendez wasn't, but others will be reticent about publicly challenging the administration on Venezuela. But quietly, they do a lot of good advising and counseling. Our friends on the Republican side are probably going to be looking at legislative vehicles to crimp the sale of oil, things of that nature. So I don't know. I guess I see some sort of a 1-2 combination. I don't think the Democrats will support anything that embarrasses the administration on Venezuela. But I think that, that there will be a lot of political pressure all around. I think the Biden administration takes the opinions they're hearing on the Hill very seriously on Venezuela. According, to my interactions with Democratic staff on the Hill, and so they almost do have a seat at the table in that regard. But I don't think it translates all the way towards support for maybe a Republican piece of legislation. But I think it all adds up to a somewhat of a firewall for the administration to keep very sober approach.
So I was pleased to see on Sunday a number of Republicans coming out commenting on the primary and the strong turnout from people who had dismissed the importance and relevance and value of the electoral process and overall. They didn't, I think they forgot to credit the Biden administration for the fact the primary took place, but that's okay. But, baby steps. But I think, look, I think there is an important role for people like Meeks and others who do have a relationship with certain members of the regime. Meeks was part of the Boston group, and as was Maduro. I think in the past there's been engagement. I'm not sure if there has been of late. I think that can be helpful in the same way that we talked about sort of the Petros and Lulas of the world. I think those who have a relationship beyond just a formal diplomatic role that those in the administration might have can be helpful in sort of reinforcing the right messaging. And I think the regime has to understand what's going on in Washington. I think there are a lot of people here who would like the Barbados Agreement to fall apart, and they're looking for ways to attack it. And so I think if the regime really wants sanctions relief, and for these sanctions not to be reimposed, they need to keep that in mind, because as Jose says, there will be political pressure on the administration to reverse the sanctions. Now, I think the administration has been very clear in their statement what they intend to do. But the politics are still complicated in Washington, even if Florida is no longer a swing state, and the regime needs to understand that to the extent that they really care about care about the lifting of even more sanctions if things go well.
One more question here.
Every country is completely by itself. I'm sorry. If you think every country is completely isolated by itself, because I would think it would be really interesting to have more bipartisan support, for example, to let the guy in Guatemala, who, by the way, everyone else was thrown out and ended up winning, actually take office in January. Does it matter if the Hill just stay silent on that too? I mean, I think that we're asking a lot to get María Corina Machado. I mean, I think it would be amazing, right, in an authoritarian context, but in a supposed democracy where you kick out everyone else, and there's no words of protest about that.
So this is a really important point.
But yet you got this Arevalo, who's an amazing candidate. Have you ever heard him talk in English? Even in English, he's amazing. And no one cares. No one writes letters. No one writes from both in a bipartisan manner. And I just think it's a little bit naive to think that, I don't know, that so what if she has all this power and has to step aside for someone else who's maybe not her, but whose interest is it? Her interest to be president of Venezuela, or the future of the country and return to democracy? I mean, I don't know, you'd still have a ton of power behind the scenes. So I don't know. I just wonder if you all think that they're at all related or not.
So I think there are two important points you make. One is, there's been a lot of bipartisan agreement on Venezuela in the United States for 2 decades. There is agreement between Democrats and Republicans on the nature of the regime. There's often been agreement about policy. Now, there have been some disagreements. And there's currently a debate, which I think is healthy, about how to most effectively leverage sanctions, because there's no right answer. We don't know what the most effective way is to use sanctions in a given context to motivate good behavior. I think the administration is doing it quite skillfully, but I think it's a valuable debate to have, and it's a debate that's taking place within the administration as well. So first, I think so number one, as you say, there has been a lot of support. Bipartisan support for the democratic cause of Venezuela, which has been absent in Guatemala. We're not here to talk about Guatemala. But I think there's only one Republican who has even commented on Arevalo and the effort to deny him his victory, and that's Congressman McCall. We haven't heard anything from others as far as I know. But I think that matters because I think it undermines the credibility of certain members if they're only speaking about the democratic cause when it's being threatened by a particular ideology, and they don't care about it when it's being threatened by others. And I think that's what we've seen, frankly, on the Republican side.
Last question. I'm going to ask each of you to pose a question to the other speaker. Jose, why don't you start?
I forgot that one.
We can let Mark start.
I knew I had forgotten to do something, and I was coming up with a question for Mark. Mark, I was struck with you're obviously, well, I wasn't struck by it, but I just note your skepticism about what happens next October if that's finally the month that election. If, as many of us expect, we come up with a very flawed product, a flawed event that really doesn't pass muster, what is the U.S. policy then?
So if I were still in government, I would say I don't do hypotheticals. But since I'm not in government, I'll do a hypothetical. Look, it's a hard call. I mean, there's been a tendency by Democrats and Republicans to use sanctions when you don't have a strategy otherwise. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we can we don't. If we were to sanction every oil-producing country that's authoritarian and corrupt, there wouldn't be much oil on the market, okay? So I think we need to think about the use of sanctions in a smart way. I think the targeted sanctions make sense. I think certain of the sectoral sanctions have not made sense. I mean, if you look at the sanctions on the gold sector, which basically just invited bad actors into the sector, I think the same was true in terms of the bond trading. And we can, discuss whether the oil sanctions made sense or not. But look, I'm more hopeful that we're not going to have to be in that position. And I do have faith in. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the power of people power, frankly. Mm-hmm. And the Venezuelan people have awoken. We saw them mobilize on Sunday. There's going to be a lot of campaign activity in the coming weeks and the coming months. And look, even in recent months, when people here were sort of dismissive of the idea of elections in Venezuela, I had a chance to go down there in July, and what I saw was that the Venezuelans, they were all in. I mean, you go to Machado's campaign headquarters, and it's lots of activity, and she's traveling all over the country. You had a primary commission under tremendous pressure, mobilizing hundreds, thousands of people to put together this primary, to NGOs doing their thing, voters who were interested. I think that's just going to build. There's going to be a momentum there. It's very, very difficult to contain. And I think the regime is starting to realize that now, which is why they're getting a little bit nervous. So I'm confident in the power and potential of Venezuelan people to produce change in a democratic way.
Mark, your question for Jose?
I got to go now.
Actually, I like this question, which is, that there has been a lot of bipartisan support, I think, mm-hmm. Around the democratic cause in Venezuela, which has been absent in other cases. And why do you think that is? And do you think it has any impact on, our ability to influence things in Venezuela?
Yeah, I am somewhat disconcerted by, the public positions of some people I consider friends and colleagues and people I admire and work with, whose offices I work with, on the lack of, I think, public concern, evincing public concerns about the erosion of democratic institutions, whether they come from the left or the right. And I have a big problem with Bukele in El Salvador. I do not like to see Republicans going there. I think that Bukele has done something rather extraordinary, and we all know that what kind of popularity he's getting by cracking down on the gangs, but at what cost? Because once you go down the path of shaving off the integrity of democratic institutions, it becomes a very slippery slope. Does that mean that every time there is a crisis, every time there is what somebody believes is an intractable problem, you get to sidestep the Constitution? I think that's a very dangerous game to play. I was very, very welcoming. I don't have a dog in the in the Guatemala fight, but I was very happy to see the statement by Chairman McCall expressing concern about what was going on in Guatemala. Again, it's about the integrity of the democratic institutions. I think that for many on our side, there is a reluctance to, meaning the conservative side, the Republican, the right of center side, there is a reluctance to go after, because we often feel that we're the minority in any setting. And in other words, the Latin America, think tank, industrial complex, the media, we're always on the defensive. So it's sort of a built-in reluctance to pick on somebody like a Bukele, or a Giammattei, who otherwise is in line with your worldview, but is making some compromises within their own country on their institutions. And I think I'm with you in that regard, Mark. We need to be consistent. I think that I don't want to hear a lecture from Petro or Lula, about, you pick only, these people that you want to defend, but what about here and all that. I think the best way to maintain your ground in arguments with them is, being consistent. And so, I admire a lot of, people on the Democratic side like Mark, who has shown no, proclivity to, to give Maduro any space to justify what he's done. And so I think that makes for a better U.S. policy in the region of consistency, and it's better for the U.S. Bilateral, regional relationships all the way around.
We are out of time, but this has been an important and I think a fascinating discussion. I want to thank Mark and Jose for coming today. Thank you to those of you in the audience and those who are tuning in online. And thanks, and we'll see you at a future Hudson event.